David. So I'm Rob Babb. I'm the strategic account exec here for Orca Security, based here in Atlanta. I cover Georgia and Tennessee enterprise accounts. We've been partnering with the AWS meetup groups around the region and coming and doing these talks. We're in the cloud security space. We are a SaaS application. We cover all the three major clouds. We also have some support for Ollie and Oracle coming soon. But we are essentially a consolidation of tools that you might have already been using elsewhere in your on-prem or cloud infrastructures. And so, what we like to help customers focus on is how to provide more contextual awareness to security in their clouds so that all the alerts that they're getting for a variety of things that could be misconfigured are prioritized in the form of the importance of risk, right? Not every alert that you get has that context in your current tool set, but Orca gives you that prioritization, right? And so that's incredibly helpful for companies to essentially figure out, one, what is all the stuff they have in the cloud, because just keeping track of it is impossible, right, without a tool like Orca. And two, how do I know what to fix first when a new vulnerability comes out or a new change happens and messes something up, right? How do I prioritize that if I'm a SOC analyst getting 1,000 alerts a day, right? And so that's where Orca comes in to help with that prioritization. But Joey is my SE. He's based in Texas. He's remote for us today, but he's going to go through a presentation. We started with the concept of the top 10 sins of cloud misconfiguration, but I think we've renamed it, right, Joey?
Yeah, we've changed it up a little bit. We'll talk about some of those, but we're going to talk a lot about context as well.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Joey since you're here to see him, but if you have any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to ask, and I'll be around throughout. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate it. It's nice to be talking to everybody. Like Rob said, Joey Merz. I'm out in the Dallas area, sales engineer for Orca. So we're gonna talk a little bit about cloud security in general. Why you should care about it. We'll talk about some misconfigurations, and that kind of fits into that top 10 sins that Rob was mentioning. But we'll also talk about Mitre. And how Mitre applies to some of the potential pitfalls and some of the things that you should be looking for from a cloud security perspective. And we'll also talk, more about the context, obviously, and how lack of context and current existing tools and existing, cloud environments is kind of leaving a lot of the risk for customers, for the end users out there. And then at the end, we'll talk just a couple slides about how CNAPP and how Orca fits into CNAPP and how we can help. But I want to kick things off and make this interactive today. So like Rob mentioned, if everybody has their phones, wants to jump in and play along, we've got a couple questions that we'll interject kind of in as we go along the presentation. So if everybody can scan that barcode, if that's possible. If not, you can just go to menti.com and put in that code. And kind of once everybody gets there, somebody can kind of give me a nod and say, hey, we're pretty good. Everybody's pretty much got it. That'd be super helpful.
I think we're just about there.
Awesome.
Help if I enter the Wi-Fi password. Might be a little faster.
Everybody good?
Yep.
All good? Awesome.
Say instructions
in the pack. So, all right. In all seriousness, we'll get into the presentation now, but wanted to kind of tee that up and have a little fun as we go through this. So the perception of cloud today, right? A lot of customers think moving to the cloud's easy. I think this is kind of a good laughing, happy point, right? That it's not as easy as everybody thinks. So the reality of the matter, right, is that that once customers get to the cloud, they find out the big surprise, right? Is there everything good? Kind of got some background noise, but that's just could be in the live event, so all good. But you know, the big surprise is that now you've got a lot more to keep secure and keeping everything secure, right? So everything from networking, storage, vulnerabilities, you know, identity and access management. You know, the cloud's really complex, and it's a tough thing to secure and keep it maintained. And the list continues to grow, obviously, with things like Kubernetes, which everybody's getting into these days. So complexity in itself is a major vulnerability, right? And that's where the cloud adds a lot to the complexity. Obviously, the shared responsibility model is new to to customers moving on to the cloud. And sometimes you think some of the things you think may be the cloud's responsibility from a security perspective might actually fall on you, right? It might fall on them. So especially when you get into things like containers and PaaS services, even VMs, right? So encryption, authentication, all these things got to be managed and secured properly. So there's lots and lots of configurations. One of the other things, the flexibility and the UI abilities of the cloud itself has a major danger, right? The single click concept can have major drastic consequences and major impacts to cloud environments. So when you roll all these up, all these complexities make it difficult to assess the overall security of the cloud estate, right? And to fully understand whether or not you're secure. And if you're not secure, where are those gaps? And the attackers, right? They're going to find the gaps, and that's where they're going to try to capitalize on your cloud estate to compromise you. Another complexity that's key is multi-cloud. So most of the companies that we see at Orca are working in more than one cloud. I think on average, the number, well, I don't think, but the average number from Orca's perspective for our customers is almost 2 as an average. So that means most of our customers are working in multiple clouds. And within multiple clouds, obviously terminology is different. Some of the architecture is different. A good example is IAM. IAM is very different from AWS to Azure. So all these things lead into that complexity that makes it, a greater challenge to manage that from a security perspective. And that complexity, right, it's really at the foundation of what causes most of the breaches and increases the overall risk, right, of most cloud environments. So why should you really care about cloud security? So if you think about when everyone was back on-prem or private cloud, whatever you want to call it, ransomware attacks, they were all focused on those environments, on those on-prem environments. But as everyone's moving to the cloud, obviously the attackers, the ransomware attacks move to the cloud environments, which, clearly those attacks are on the rise. As of this week, right, Okta and their compromise, the events that happened with them were at least announced, this week or last week. So obviously with, everybody migrating to cloud, there's just tons of attacks that are happening against cloud environments. And, a couple of the key areas that attackers are really looking at is obviously going to be focused around IAM related issues and then overall misconfigurations. So we got to keep in mind. Sorry, was there a question?
Because I'm on a Zoom meeting. Okay, sweetheart, I love you too. Bye.
Got it. Okay. So just keep in mind, right, that a lot of companies are trying to depend primarily on real-time detection. And that's probably not the only approach that you want to consider and keep in mind, right? Because if the software can detect and stop the attacks, that's one thing, right? But detection is based upon, with those products, is going to be based upon the things that you know. So if you can set it up, configure it correctly, that's great. But it's going to be based upon the things that you know. And that kind of speaks to visibility. If you don't have the visibility around all of your assets, well, maybe they're not configured correctly, maybe they're not protected. So that's going to, potentially generate some security gaps in your environments. So now just, I'm going to give you some stats on some of the things. And I don't know if you guys will find these enlightening or familiar or frightening in some ways, right? It's surprising to me working in the security industry that these numbers are as high as they are. So if we talk about ransomware, 90% of organizations have got identities that could be used to execute ransomware attacks, against S3 buckets or blob storage if it's Azure related, right? 70% of organizations have got exposed internet assets that are linked to identities that have permissions to launch ransomware attacks, right? Those numbers are that's really high. 45% of organizations have third-party identities that are enabled, allowing ransomware attacks by elevating to admin privileges, right? So allow that elevation to get up to admin level privileges. So if we break it down and talk about IAM, right, which is kind of the new firewall, if you will, 55% of organizations have IAM users with console access, and they don't have multi-factor authentication enabled. And it's amazing, and I may capture this again in a little bit, but the number of root accounts that don't have MFA enabled on them is something that we find far too frequently. 6% of orgs have at least one workload that's accessible using either a weak or a leaked password. So that number is small, but that's a big thing, right? That attackers are going to go after. 24% of organizations aren't using MFA in one of their cloud accounts, root accounts, like I mentioned, right? Or they're super admin users. So that's another big no-no, right? No MFA on those root accounts. Misconfigurations from a security perspective, right? 70% of organizations reported their cloud security IT operations, dev teams, they're not aligned on their security policies. So I know there's some developers in the room from the intro there. So I'm sure you guys can feel that, but and understand that. But a lot of those groups there's a lot of friction in between a lot of those different departments today. So with that, we'll keep on moving. We're going to jump back actually, and we're going to do another quick question. So everybody want to grab their phones. We're going to have one more. We got a couple of these as we go along, but we'll jump in and have another one. All right. So now that we kind of did the little questionnaire on that, we'll see some numbers about what this really looks like. And this obviously varies from different sources. But really what we're focused on here is, what are these causes and what are the impacts to them? So if we look at lack of knowledge and best practices, right, again, complexity plays a major factor here. Maintaining the deep expertise, right, across all of the cloud in the multi-cloud environment is incredibly challenging, right? So what happens when someone doesn't have the deep expertise in a given area? They configure something because maybe the SME is not available. And maybe that misconfiguration goes unknown until an attacker, ends up you end up with a breach, right? An attacker comes in and causes some issues, right? So there's all kinds of situations like that. Lack of visibility, we've mentioned before, right? But as we all know, the cloud is clearly very dynamic and ephemeral just in nature, and it's increasing more and more, obviously, with Kubernetes and all the PaaS-based services. Things are always changing. Things are always being configured. Workloads are coming up and down. And this causes gaps in visibility. When you look at traditional tools and how they provide visibility, there's going to be gaps, right? Just because traditionally a lot of those tools are agent-based, and keeping up with agents and reporting and all the complexities of the VPCs and IAM configurations is going to be a challenge. So, how do we maintain a current inventory of all these assets? It's not just instances, not just containers, right? But it's all the users, it's the roles, it's permissions, it's serverless, it's pods, and on and on and on we go, right? There's so many different assets, if you will, or identities within the cloud estate to try to gain visibility, and they all fit together to really either provide opportunities for those attackers or provide a cohesive security platform for us. Speed of deployment, right? Another area, the business is telling you, we got to have this stuff deployed. We got to have it up and running. And maybe we, don't follow the standards all the times. People make mistakes. Those inconsistencies then, combined with the market pressures, cause all kinds of opportunities for misconfigurations. Default account and service configurations, right? They're still common. We see this in almost every account. That even in highly proceduralized environments, best practices don't always get followed. And some of these default configs can end up exposing, significant risks. Why is cloud security so difficult? We've talked about adoption and people are migrating to the cloud. Maybe we don't have the right personnel. We're not educated. We don't have the personnel that's educated on all the right things. Shared responsibility model. It's something that's not well understood by at least we'll say our customers at Orca. An example of Lambda, right? With a serverless Lambda type of deployment. Who does the updates, right, to keep the runtime from being, becoming vulnerable, right? So there's a lot of shared responsibilities there, and they vary depending on the type of IaaS or PaaS-based services that are being utilized. Identities and permissions, they tend to lead to exposure. So understanding the identities and the permitted actions is extremely complicated. Looking through the UIs, right, it's not super easy to really understand all the implications of this. So this is, a common area that we see a lot is over permissioning. It happens far too often. And that context comes into play here, right, that it's lacking when we look at those identities or we look at those assets and the permission combinations. The combination of those entities together are what enable attackers to come in and break through that security screen that we're leaving open for them. Misconfigured S3 buckets, those are ample opportunity, right? So effective mitigation features are not always enabled on S3 buckets. Understanding which buckets have sensitive data or private information, you got to monitor that stuff or you got to search for it. How do you know that somebody hasn't dumped a database or dumped a bunch of files that have PII in them, right? How do you monitor for that? How do you track that and know that if you've got that publicly accessible bucket that attackers are not getting at it, or they're maybe going to get at it through the ability of having permissions once they get their initial access into an environment, get access to maybe a VM or a container. How do they do they have permissions to get access into those S3 buckets? The last one I'll talk about here is neglected assets. This is something that's prolific. It's a huge pain for everybody, right? Managing vulnerabilities. It's a never-ending task. That list of vulnerabilities, I did a talk on this a couple months ago. Just the sheer numbers, they're impossible to keep up with. And I think the goal of older times of trying to have everything patched and all the vulnerabilities closed, it's not feasible for most environments, especially given the cloud and the ephemeral nature of it. So we gotta have visibility into those vulnerabilities, and the contextual pieces will help us understand which of those assets we need to patch first and give us the ability to prioritize the right vulnerabilities on the right sets of assets so that we don't get attacked and don't get breached. So I meant to stop earlier on this. I'll take a quick breath here. Any questions about anything we've covered up to this point? All right. Maybe I put everybody to sleep, but we'll keep going. So, now we'll start talking about more about what attackers are looking for. So what's the end goal of the attackers, right? They want to do, one of a handful of things. They either want to install ransomware, they want to exfiltrate data, maybe they want to cause denial of service type of events, or something we find more and more often now is they want to do crypto mining, right? So they want to get in, get those crypto miners installed. But if we look at what the attackers can use to do that, right? They're gonna pick up automated tools out there. There's tools that are going to help them find open APIs, domains, or open S3 buckets, those sorts of things. But ultimately, they're trying to get the credentials and find out where the vulnerabilities are that they can exploit to get into the environment, right? Get that privileged access through IAM so that they can do what they want for their end goal. So one of the things that we can use here, and if everybody's familiar with Mitre, fantastic. And if you're not, please definitely dig in and take a look. These Mitre frameworks, we're obviously integrating them into our platform, but This is going to give good examples and things that you can actually leverage to try to mitigate some of these issues because attackers are going to use the actual techniques that are defined within the Mitre frameworks. So, these are kind of real world scenarios that Mitre uses when they build out these frameworks. So here we're looking at the Cloud IaaS matrix. So you'll see, right, things like initial access or persistence or privileged escalation. These are all focused around IaaS. But the main thing that you want to focus on here is that you can review. If you go to the Mitre site and you pull up these matrix, the different matrices, you can actually drill in and you can see what the attackers would do to attack you with these specific areas, right? So they can be really helpful to help you mitigate and help understand how to stop that initial access, right? Simple things like, have I assessed all of my cloud accounts all for default accounts or trust relationships, and also any internet exposed applications. And as we talk about applications, obviously that's another major factor in the entire equation. So you're not just running cloud configuration, but you're running workloads in the cloud, right, on operating systems. So when you're talking about security in cloud, you also need to take into consideration those workloads, whether they're Windows or Linux or all the different operating systems. They're prime, right? They're prime candidates for attackers to use, and also to enable that lateral movement and exfiltrate data. So you don't have to only worry about the cloud configurations, obviously, but you also got to worry about the workload configurations, what applications they're running, and what that enables the attackers to do as well. So this really, this combination, right, gives the attackers a large library of potential attack opportunities against these misconfigurations, right? Could be misconfigurations, could be default credentials like we've talked about, could be legitimate credentials that have weak or known passwords, and obviously the vulnerabilities that are going to allow things like remote code execution. So what's the outcome in some of these cases, right? The outcome is you have data breaches, right? We've seen it all the time, like I mentioned with Okta, and many times it's all about simple misconfigurations. Could be a public an S3 bucket, right? That's public. Even though the cloud providers have, default configurations that would block this, we find this all the time. So it's definitely things to monitor and check and look and make sure those things are configured so that they're blocking access and not allowing that access. So one example, maybe you created an S3 bucket to serve a website. Somebody decides to dump that database like we mentioned, right, or a bunch of PDFs. They got PII. Now you've exposed that potentially to the attackers. So I think the summarization here is that you have to have your configurations. You have to know what to look for to make sure your configurations are tight, that your application security is tight as well. But you need to monitor it, and the ongoing pieces monitoring, and that's not easy to do. Today, there's a lot of point tools that'll look at it from the different points that we've talked about today. But being able to put that into context is really kind of the missing piece here that allows you to target in and focus on the areas where the attackers are going to focus. So this kind of goes back to that top 10 sins where we originated the topic of conversation that here, but we'll just touch on this a bit. And what we did here is we pulled out some of the common high-risk misconfigurations that are very common. You see the distribution there in the bottom right corner. So obviously, internet-facing VM instance with full access to AWS. It's something that we find far too often, and it has major, major implications. But I think it'll make sense. We can talk about these individually, but internet-facing VM with admin privileges or network security group that allows direct RDP. Those top four, including role, can be assumed by anyone. Those are really four key areas, but it probably makes more sense if we kind of drill in a little bit more and look at them individually. So if we kind of break them down, IAM, I would say, is probably the most important set of security controls when it comes to cloud. Lost or stolen credentials, right? They're the attacker's most used tool. And if you try to understand, these things individually, it's hard. That's why we're talking about context so much, right? First things you need to figure out are, is the asset internet facing? And then, what permissions does that, if we take the instance of a VM, right? What permissions does it have? What role it has, and what permissions are gained through that role. And then can it get to a bucket, or, if it's Azure, a blob storage, right? And what permissions does it have against that bucket? So these are the kind of things that that our customers really don't have visibility to and are very much unaware going into their relationship with Orca. And it's because of that missing context, right? So it's hard to pull all that context together with existing tools today, right? So we need a way to pull that together and define that security risk in a way that it's actionable so that we can address it. We can stop that initial access from that attacker. Unused roles or policies, again, we see this a ton. Unused roles that have policies that are going to give permissions that can be assumed by an attacker once they get that initial access and they start to move throughout the estate. IAM roles with admin privileges, right? This speaks directly to the least privilege model, and we find it a lot, right? So one example of this could be, someone requests access, but they can't specify exactly what the scope of the permissions required, right? Nobody's ever seen that before, right? But they end up being given admin privileges, or privileges well beyond what they really need for a given situation. It's not a good practice. It's clearly not least privilege, but it happens in a large majority of environments today. We talked about this earlier, but MFA not being enabled, right? Especially on those root accounts, any kind of administrative privilege accounts. It's a very common problem, and it's something that's pretty easy to address. All right, so let's talk about workload misconfigurations. We talked a lot about kind of the cloud plane and IAM, but from the workload side. Yeah, sorry, was there a question?
There was one question in the chat. Robert, do you want to ask? He typed, with AWS free tier, as a curious salesperson, I have an account that I'm not sure is 100% secure. I don't use it much, just play around. Should I be concerned at that level?
You just have an individual AWS account, like a personal account?
Your credit card's in it, you should be.
Yeah, that's it.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point with the credit cards, right? If you happen to deploy, say you deploy a VM and it has a public IP address, it's potentially externally accessible. Maybe it has vulnerabilities on it, depending on what access you have creating that. That VM could be attacked, and they could take over your AWS account, which is going to give them full access. So yeah, everybody should be concerned. Yeah.
I appreciate it. A second question I have in those regards is, as a AWS, I guess a partner selling into different accounts. A lot of times I run into people who, are professionals by their definition. What's the best way, would you say, to to start or enable a conversation about really how secure they are? I mean, what's a polite way of asking them to, let's go deep dive and use use a tool like you have or what have you, versus just letting them say that they're taken care of?
Well, that's an interesting question, and there's a lot of ways to go about it. I tend to take a question or a response to a question like that they're secure, and ask them why they think they're secure, and kind of drill into that conversation about do you have tools in place that makes you feel that you're secure? Do you have reporting up from the teams and the environment, whether it be native cloud tools, external tools that are giving you reporting on your posture management as a whole, that makes you feel that way? Really, why is it that you do? And is that something that you feel comfortable about every day after today? As in, are you continually scanning? Do you continually have 100% visibility of everything? Do you, other questions like, do you know that anybody that has the ability to spin up, any type of asset in your cloud accounts is following very regimented, documented procedures? Or do they have, the ability to just spin up, at will? If you have developers, do developers have the ability to ad hoc create assets inside of your cloud environments? And if that's the case, how do you know that they're deploying all the tools that make you feel comfortable and secure about your overall posture? So there's a lot of ways to go about it, but I think a flat response like that deserves a follow-up question about why and what are the real numbers and statistics that make you feel that way.
Perfect, Joe. I appreciate it.
You bet.
I guess conversation starter will ask, when was last time your organization has conducted a pen test, either internal or by external contractors or consulting firms?
You're asking that about Orca specifically?
No, I'm saying, I guess follow up on Robert's
Oh,
question.
gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Right. A pen test is one of those, and
unless it's tested, it's not real.
Well, I think the thing about a pen test is that's only once or twice a year sometimes at some of the most secure organizations.
Yeah, depending on people different organizations have different maturity level.
Right.
And if they say they may not even aware that's something they need to do, then you'll have a totally different conversation.
I think the concept of a pen test, it's become antiquated in the sense that cloud changes so frequently that a pen test that's done today, you could do a pen test 6 days out of the week, but the day you didn't do it, you could have 1,000 changes in your cloud that could make you susceptible to an attack that very day, right?
Yeah.
And so, unless you have a tool set capable of doing a continuous sort of pen test or a continuous analysis or a continuous assessment, you're leaving yourself open to gaps. It's kind of like if someone's saying, I believe I'm secure, right, because of X, Y, and Z controls I've put into place. Well, if you're a person monitoring those tools, right, you have to monitor them all the time, right? Or you have to outsource to an MSSP service, or someone has to be looking at them all the time.
Yeah.
And that's just it's not something we see very often, that people are on top of their tools at that level, right? Because they'll often ask about runtime level responses, right? And the best question back to them is, well, how quickly can you respond to an alert from a runtime based approach? And oftentimes it's not less than 4 hours, and it's more like 24 to 48 hours. And that just goes back to the fact that organizations are run by people. Those people are only there between 9 to 5, right? The off hours staff has too many things they're looking at, right? And it's just too hard to keep up with all the changes going on.
Right, that's both, I guess, tooling, internal business process, operation process, and whether it's priority for the organization to even place resources, money behind those things.
Yeah. There's a lot of risk management sort of that has to happen.
Right.
And I would say, kind of to the point you were making, Rob, right? With the pen test, it's very much a point in time, and it's kind of the arrow approach. Whereas with cloud, giving all of the identities and all the assets, the ephemeral nature of it, the overall security approach really needs to take more of a blanket kind of viewpoint, and that's why compliance frameworks are an important part of that as well, because if you take into account the compliance framework concept and managing to the individual controls of could be industry specific, like HIPAA or something like that. But if you take like the CSA or CIS, PCI type of compliance frameworks, those are going to prove out that you're being hygienic about how you're managing your cloud estate. And that blanket approach is going to, what we see and what we obviously promote and sell as a security concept, though, that's going to give you that confirmation that you're doing the right processes day in, day out. You're managing the standards in which you're deploying the ephemeral, type of workloads that we're seeing in the cloud. And that's going to be a much more comprehensive, consistent, enduring type of process for securing your cloud. It doesn't negate the fact that, hey, you still might need to have real-time type of protection. Maybe it's on specific sets of assets that are very, very close to the internet, right? Going to be, high probability for an attacker, high risk type of situations, or your, what we call the crown jewels, your most highly regarded, closely held sets of data that you want to make sure is absolutely and completely protected at all costs. So that's where, we tend to work with our clients, and some of them are using some of those real-time products that we can work kind of hand in hand, because you really need to keep both in consideration. But it is really more about that ongoing monitoring and that hygiene and those best practices that seems to be the consistent approaches that we've seen being successful across the industry. Any other questions? This is great conversation. All right, I'm going to jump back in and we'll talk about workloads, right? So if we start thinking about from the workload side, right, like we mentioned earlier, a lot of things we see neglected, vulnerable workloads, right? 80% of organizations have got frontline or internet-facing workloads that are unpatched or even have unsupported operating systems. We see organizations that have got 2 to 3 critical vulnerabilities to 500 to 600 critical vulnerabilities on some of these hosts, right? They just don't have visibility into them. They haven't been being maintained. And obviously, those scenarios are prime candidates, right? Another area, right, is from authentication is weak or leaked passwords. We find weak passwords very commonly. We also look for leaked passwords in large databases of known leaked passwords, and it's a common thing that obviously attackers are going to go after, trying to crack using those well-known passwords. SSH services configured, open to the cloud. Users creating accounts with passwords, passwords like passwords, right, or QWERTY, or the leaked passwords. Those are majors. And then for lateral movement, this provides, a major area that we talk about private keys giving access to other systems, right? So this is something we visualize in Orca, but, having that private key, if it's on that initial access device that an attacker gets to, and they can find, the public keys that they can allow them to navigate onto other resources, right? That's where they're going to get to the right resources and then try to achieve that escalated privileged escalation. So a couple honorable mentions, right? We've talked about S3 buckets being public, but it still happens a ton. We find them with PII on them a lot. Root accounts being used, right? So this goes against the first rule of least privilege. You should never use the root accounts. It happens. They get used. How do you monitor that today, right? It's not easy. And then, a couple others, cross-count access from external vendors. We see that quite often, as well as, believe it or not, databases that are open to the internet that are publicly facing. So just a couple more to keep in mind. All right, we're going to jump back and we're going to have one more question. So everybody grab their phones and jump in, and we'll do one more. All right, very good. All right, so let's bump back over here and we'll hit a couple more. So why aren't existing solutions helping you address these problems, right? So lack of visibility, right? Lack of context, risk prioritization, alert fatigue, which obviously a lot of people here are seeing that challenge. But, what I really want to talk about, obviously core to our conversation today, we can talk about alert fatigue. Orca does a fantastic job of reducing that by bringing vulnerabilities together into a single alert. But what we really want to talk about is context. So if we talk a little bit about context, why is it so important? What is so important about the context, right, when it comes to prioritization? So like we've talked about, if you try to understand what it takes to do a ransomware attack in the cloud, it requires a few different components, right? You need roles, you need users, you need groups, you need S3 buckets, and maybe VMs, KMS keys. There's different exposures based upon different permissions across all those different objects. So being able to understand which one is more important is really critical, right? So, for example, a role or a user can give an attacker more leverage. Is really how you need to know how to prioritize that, right? So understanding the context of the permissions across the objects is more important. So being able to find that proper prioritization and therefore minimize the attacker's leverage, right? So let's take that to the next one. So, same thing kind of goes for vulnerabilities, across all the clouds. You may have hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of vulnerabilities. So how do we prioritize which ones are most important? Traditionally, this has been by CVSS score in many cases, right? And like I talked about early on, patching everything, not really feasible for most organizations anymore, especially with the ephemeral nature of containers and that sort of thing. So the other piece of this is, we have vulnerabilities, but do we have fixes for the vulnerabilities? Can we even fix them? Are we going to spend time digging through all the alerts when we don't even have a fix that we can apply? Is that vulnerability going to be network based? Does it have remote code execution capabilities? Are there exploits that script kiddies could take advantage of and make a highly likely candidate for somebody to attack us with? And then, last mentioned here, but definitely not last, is it internet facing, right? The asset that the vulnerability resides on. So all these things are really matter in figuring out how you prioritize, but they're not easy to figure out, within the context, right, of different tools feeding into a SIM has been a kind of a traditional way of trying to handle that. But there's a lot of things that get lost in the translation that are really important to really understanding that context, right? But understanding that very clearly, if I can understand I have a VM that's internet facing, it's got a vulnerability on it, that vulnerability has remote code execution capabilities, there's an exploit out there that's in the wild that somebody's gonna go for, that should be a top priority for me to go patch first, right? So being able to put that together is not always easy. Why is that missing, right? I mentioned this a bit already, but the traditional tools, whether it's tools that were used in the private cloud, they're agent-based, or you've got a posture management tool that stands on its own, individual or independent vulnerability scanners, other inventory-based solutions, maybe a CWPP that's giving you information about your workloads. How do you put it all together, right? Like I already said with the SIM, that's kind of been the answer, but it's hard to do, it's hard to maintain, and it doesn't always give you still the context that you really need in a very consumable and very actionable way. So, why do we need to understand context? I think it's probably good to kind of see an example of what this is, and this is an Orca slide that we use to illustrate an example of, if you kind of look in the bottom right-hand corner there, you've got two different servers. They're both running an Apache service. They have the same CVE on them, but they should be categorized with different risk levels. And Orca obviously treats one as an imminent compromise, one as a hazardous. And if we look at, why server one is sitting behind a load balancer, right? It's obviously running Apache service. You got to assume there's going to be 443 ports, maybe port 80 open to that server. It can also connect to other servers, connect to PII via a database or a set of files or S3 storage, right? Could be an example there. That's a very different scenario than server two, which has an internal client, no external access capabilities. There's no PII. We should treat those very differently. And Orca is going to be able to do that, right? So one other example that's pretty timely still, I think, is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds is Log4j, right? When Log4j came out, we had a lot of customers coming to us saying, what do I do? How do I figure out the impact that Log4j has on my environment? And they needed to figure out how to prioritize the Log4j examples that they had. So, you've got that embedded in assets that sit deep inside of your cloud estate that don't have external access. Should definitely be a different priority than where you've got Log4j running, close to the internet on those services that are externally exposed. So being able to take that, 1,000 servers or whatever it is that they may have and boil that down to 10, mitigate the risk, keep an attacker from coming in, getting to the crown jewels via log4j type of exploit right out of the gate. That makes a major impact on securing an environment given, a very timely type of an event. So I put this slide in here. This is kind of bringing together, we talked about the Mitre attack chains as well as the contextual information, but this is kind of the goal is to be able to visualize and understand the attack path that attacker is going to go after. So in this case, we see, the attack flow where we've got an Nginx server. There's service vulnerabilities that you can see. That server also has an insecure private key that is going to enable lateral movement to our Jenkins production server. And then, so an attacker would move from the web Nginx server to the Jenkins production server. There's another private key there. And that's going to give action, access to the production web server. So that just really illustrates very clearly, I think, to the point that we're talking about. How would you address that? And this is very common. This is not, this is not a made up scenario. This is something we see very often. But being able to come back to your web Nginx server that has the initial access capability for the attacker, stop that by addressing that service vulnerability, gives you the ability to take longer period of time to address the downstream, vulnerabilities that lie within the environment because you're stopping that initial access point. Any questions about that or anything since our last stop? Cool. All right, I'm going to wrap this up pretty quickly, guys, but I just wanted to mention, kind of going back to, before Orca. So Orca is going to be able to detect, right, all the risks that matter most. So it's comprehensive across the board. So not only looking as, at vulnerabilities, but operating systems and applications, including the components that make up the applications, like all the packages and the libraries that you would need for vulnerability scanning. But Orca is going to also detect all the misconfigs, machines that have already been compromised that have malware on them, or neglected workloads that haven't been on anybody's radar for maybe years, right, and haven't been patched. The visibility into lateral movement, right? Whether it's being escalated privileges or lateral movement via, private SSH keys, all those things can be detected and visualized. But then kind of bringing it full back to what I was mentioning, kind of the overall approach to security is also addressing the hygiene, right? All the basics that from IAM across the board that need to be within the hygienic processes and mapping those back to compliance frameworks. Orca takes that all into account, automates that process of taking those compliance frameworks controls and mapping them to the detected alerts that Orca that provides via our agentless scanning, right? So all this is available with about 10 minutes to add your accounts into the Orca platform. So there's nothing really to deploy. And we get this via, API calls into the cloud plane to get all the cloud information. And then the way we achieve the workload information without using agents is we actually leverage the snapshotting capabilities of all the cloud providers. We take snapshots of the workloads. We scan those snapshots with our scanning technologies. We extract all the metadata, then we combine that with all the data from the cloud plane or the posture management type of information to give that comprehensive and contextual view into the overall cloud estate security posture. So I'll leave you with some best practices, some things to think about. Visibility, we didn't talk that much about it today, but getting 100% visibility is super, super important. And it's not just posture management, it's that workload that's also has got to be part of that visibility. And that continual scanning, right? Kind of back to the pen test, right? We want to be about scanning that every single day, making sure we know what our security posture is on an ongoing basis. Prioritizing the risk, making sure we can, address the things that are the most important from a security risk perspective, identifying those exposed assets, things with excessive permissions. And then being able to automate those, the information that's coming out, whether that's, generating Jira tickets, getting it into, a SOAR for automation on the back end, notifications, all that as well. And then, like I just talked about, the automating the compliance frameworks. So with Orca, right, all this is going, all these, different tools and capabilities that we've talked about are all consolidated into a single tool, which gives a lot of SIEM capabilities straight up. That's I think I've probably rehashed it enough. We'll kind of leave it with that. Happy to take any other questions. I do want to ask you one last question in the Mentimeter, if you would. I'd love to know, which part of the conversation today you found, most effective or most valuable to you. Was the quizzes, the discussion, or the presentation? So that's what I've got. So any other questions from anybody?
2, 3 questions. One. You mentioned the context is to, in part, to prioritize the risk based on how close it is to the enemy based on the parameters. And that notion, to your point, is also a little bit dated from that perspective, because now it's moving towards zero trust and then also defensive depth. Any quick comments you have from practicing with clients, etc., will be helpful. And related to that, in practice, certainly add more layers to it helps from architecture perspective. So from even for Log4j injecting, etc., I wish at work we actually had a WEF02 version 2 already in place. At the time, only have version 1, does not have not able to use it right away to stop it from the border. So that's kind of from both directions. First, the border or parameter is a little bit dated. At the same time, it's still relevant. I want to hear, I guess, you guys take.
Yeah, so maybe Joe, if I can take the Log4j one, and then you can take the other one. So Log4j is interesting because a WAF only protects you if the service is running and if Log4j is part of the running service that is absorbing some sort of user supplied data, like in a field on a web form, right? The WAF does nothing for your backend systems that might use Log4j for other things. So for example, we find Log4j buried deep inside of like Splunk agents that are installed on your servers, or Datadog, or any number of other tools. We find it buried deep inside of custom developed code, right? And that stuff sits deep inside of your infrastructure. And what can happen is, even though you might plug the hole on the outside with the WAF, right? If there's some other way that data gets ingested to a logging service further back in your architecture, it can still exploit one of those other places where Log4j exists.
Right. I guess it's reduce the attack surface or remove one of the vectors out of the picture, so you can focus on internal, etc. as well.
Right. And so even from the internal, though, you could have a scenario where something goes through your perimeter and is passed through fine. Maybe you patch Log4j on your perimeter, and now it just passes whatever that string is normally through that one server in that one patch system. But if that log entry somehow was replicated through a SIEM tool or through some other messaging queue or something to your backend systems, then those backend systems could take that data stream and parse it through their Log4j instance that might not be patched yet. Right. And so you've got landmines back there deeper in your architecture that you still have to deal with. That's why it was such a major issue for the entire global internet. And then Joey, you want to talk about the risk prioritization and the question around that?
Could you summarize that a bit for me? I was getting a lot of chop and getting about every third word. So if somebody could give me a bit of a summary there, that would be helpful.
Yes, it's kind of, on one way, we're saying the parameter prioritizing parameter is a little bit dated from the notion the industry is moving towards zero trust. And basically to each his own, I don't trust anyone else near me, regardless of inside or outside. And the proposition using parameter as from reducing vector or minimize the attack surface perspective is still valuable, but it's not as valuable as it before when the parameter is truly your parameter. It may never be the case, but we all come from those ages.
Did you catch all that, Joey?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time. I don't know if it's the mic, the phone.
Take it. So, yeah, I'll take it. So the concept of zero trust, it breaks down a lot when you're dealing with the vulnerabilities, right? Yes, you're limiting your blast radius by having only a few systems potentially that can talk to that system with a vulnerability, right? But at some point, you're exposing something to the public internet, right? And what we're saying is that you're either doing that intentionally, or in the cloud, more often than not, it's unintentional, right? It's very easy for a developer to go into a cloud web portal and just check a box and say, I'm on the internet, right? And just forget about it. We often do proof of concepts with clients, and we drop in, Orca to monitor their environment. And usually they set us up with a test dev to start, right? And we'll so often find, hey, they stood up something in their test dev environment. They connected it to the internet to get some patches or pull down some libraries or talk to GitHub or whatever. And they forgot to shut it off. And it's been sitting there for weeks or months or even years, right? We had one the other week where they were actually POCing another company's product, and they deployed a virtual machine in their test environment, and that thing had to talk out to the internet. And within just a few minutes of being on the internet, as they stood it up, it was getting bombarded by China brute force attacks against the SSH server, right? And just stuff like that. So I think the issue isn't that zero trust doesn't help you. It's just that zero trust doesn't solve it, because there's so many ways you can screw up zero trust, right? Sure. So unless you have controls that really limit, your developers, which then slows them down to do their development work, you're sort of in a catch-22. Right.
Yep. And that even goes into, a lot of the progressive clients that we work with are deploying everything with code, right? So everything is infrastructure as code, which helps mitigate a lot of that. Obviously, it still happens, right? As long as humans are involved, things will bypass the processes at some point in time, right? I've been in this industry far longer than I care to even admit here, but it's multiple decades, and that problem has been there all along, and it's never changed. It's just been exacerbated, right? There's never 100% foolproof, and that's why we've taken the approach that we have, obviously showing the attack vectors, prioritizing the alerts, but also not minimizing the hygienic factors that are so important, that go back to those compliance frameworks, right? It's the day-to-day hygiene to make sure you're following those practices, but also when those gaps come up, you want to be able to visualize them. You want to be able to get to them, alert on them very quickly, so that you can address them in a prioritized fashion.
I'll add one more thing, though. You asked about defense in depth. We do capture things like firewall rules and WAF rules and stuff like that that's in the cloud that we can pull from the cloud management layer. We'll capture that and recognize it as we're doing our risk scoring against, how risky that asset is, even if it is on the internet, right? So if let's say it's got SSH open, but the SSH port isn't open on the firewall or on the load balancer, right? We'll recognize that. And so it's not truly exposed.
Right. That's great. I mean, that definitely helped with the context and the prioritization of the remediation efforts. Related to that is getting into the weeds a little bit. I definitely like the fact the context map by Orca actually take into account what this guy is doing in the general computing context within the organization. If I go to the most basic thing is you were looking at the CVE in the first place is because someone says, I have this version versus what the new version, the fixed version should be. And I'm a Red Hat guy by trade for many years by now. And most people know Red Hat and its descendants always backport security patch to a stable and sanely aged version. Even as of yesterday, I was looking at a leading scanner reporting our EKS cluster has blah blah blah. You should have like four or five different Golang versions as 1.15 blah blah, and all from AWS itself. There's nothing we can do. Yet at the same time, of course, if I just actually Google a little bit, the Golang itself was 118. The recommended version is 117, and Red Hat is pretty happy with 115. Even Python is 2.7. So I wonder if from that perspective, does Orca or the partner you guys use for CVE reporting has any additional intelligence, even just
Yes.
Red Hat has been so dominant for so long, and Amazon Linux version 2 and version 1 also is based on Red Hat.
So I can take that one again, since it's in the room.
Okay.
So we obviously link to the National Vulnerability Database, right? And so with no other context, we will pull their information. However, we go more specific based on the specificity of what we're scanning. So if it's an AMI from Amazon, we will look to Amazon's vulnerability database that they publish and look at what they're saying about that AMI and that version of that package on it. If it's Red Hat, for example, we'll look at Red Hat's version, right? And so whatever's the most specific is how we will score our vulnerability scan of your systems. So if Red Hat's information against the system that we're scanning for you says, hey, 1.15 is fine, right? Because they backported it, then we'll accept that, and then we won't flag it. Or we'll mark it as resolved, right? If they go from like 1.15.1 to 1.15.2, right? And that's their nomenclature, we'll recognize that as resolved.
That's certainly a much sensible way to do it, but I guess I have seen my fair share of scanners, CV, etc. Always.
Most of them just go to the National Vulnerability Database and just go off of that. Like one time and they're done. They don't go any deeper.
They're based on the, I guess, upstream version, which is way, I mean, several generations away from the actual vendor version people are using.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, we source, I think it's 21. I pulled up the list, but it's at least 20 different sources that we use to feed into our vulnerability decision process. Red Hat Security Advisories is clearly one of those. Actually, I can share this. Let me just share this for you if you want to see it.
How long it takes to scan, like, 1,000 machines?
Awesome question. Joey, did you catch that?
Yeah. How long does it take to scan 1,000 machines? The question is, it depends. No, that's a bad answer. In all seriousness, we will scan pretty much every client environment. Not pretty much. We scan every client environment in at least every 24 hours. So our architecture is very scalable. So if you have, typically, if you're going to have, large numbers in the thousands of workloads, I'll say, that's going to be distributed across multiple cloud accounts, very typically. So we distribute that workload out, and the Orca virtual servers that do that scanning work in a one-for-one kind of basis. So it's not a sequential scanning type of process. The varying pieces really more factor into how large the snapshots are. So how large the volumes associated with those workloads play more of a factor than anything else. So we're not real time in that sense, but we are moving very close to real time. And in the coming next quarter or two, with all of our trigger based scanning, it's going to be very much close to real time. But just don't misunderstand what I'm saying here, though. We're not going to replace real time scanners as what we do, but we have a very efficient, very scalable scanning process.
Sorry, if this was mentioned before, I was late. So you mentioned agentless for taking advantage of snapshot. Are we talking about e-based volumes, some shots, and then attached to your own clean room or scanner.
That's right. Of that, so we spin up our own scan and image in our cloud account or in yours, right, depending upon your sensitivity to security and privacy. And then we use that scanner to mount the snapshot volume, which then allows us to go file for file through the entire volume and inventory what we find.
It would be tricky to deal with encrypted volume though.
We also mount the KMS of the cloud, and so we'll use that KMS access to decrypt the volume.
And in that case, have to grant access, essentially.
That's right, yeah, but it's always read-only. Certain keys can, depending upon what you want to grant access to, check that as well.
Thank you.
Great questions. Anyone on the phone still have any questions? See a few people out there. Was this helpful for everyone? Was give you some new things to think about, some new context to consider? I like when our competitors are nodding.
We don't compete with you. We don't do that.
I thought the stats were neat towards the beginning, because I don't do much of the DevOps work, but it kind of gives me an insight into in my own personal environment that I play with, the things I need to go back home and start checking, so.
Well, I think it's also, it's scarily comforting, if that's a way to phrase it, right? Like, everyone's in the same boat and everyone's doing equally bad.
Yeah.
And, I think the things you can take away from it is, there's a lot of different tools out there. A lot of people are using a lot of different tools.
Mm-hmm.
The ecosystem is only getting better with companies like Orca coming on the market and simplifying things. And so, the promise of cloud to develop fast and securely is becoming much more of a reality. It's just things change so fast, you got to keep up with it. Tools are better at keeping up with things than people are.
Yeah, and also I've been in this space a long time, so I used to work for Evident.io, which got bought by Palo Alto and formed the basis for Prisma Cloud. Exact same problems that we're seeing today. So people, like, you can do everything you want, but people are still people. You still see S3 buckets.
Right.
I mean, you can't fix stupid, or not even people are stupid, but you're busy during time. Like I think you talked
A lot
about,
of accidents.
you set something up, you just never go back because you're on to the next fire.
I worked for Choice Point back in the day, which for those that have lived in this area for a while, probably remember hearing their data leak, but
Mm-hmm.
it had nothing to do with anything other than just simple humans allowing people that shouldn't have access in.
Yeah.
I mean, just standard social networking, our social engineering stuff, so.
Right.
Which is good enough, otherwise we wouldn't have jobs, right? It's not us. They have to get real jobs.
Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you having us, David. And,
Yeah, Absolutely. Thanks, guys.
Hope everyone got some value out of it. And if we can be of service to anyone, please don't hesitate to let us know.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Yeah, and if anybody
Thanks,
has
everybody.
an idea for a future event, reach out to me, let me know if you want to present something, or if there's something, we would love to hear us in a future meeting, just reach out. Let me know. Thanks, everybody.
Unlike her.